Welcome to episode 251, When Parents Split Late, Supporting Adult Children of Divorce, featuring Linda Hershman, licensed marriage and family therapist. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes by Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Elizabeth Irias, and I am delighted to be joined again today by Linda Hershman. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and she had previously come on the podcast to talk with us about divorce in later years of one's life. And now she has come back today for a conversation about supporting and understanding some potential realities for the adult children of divorce. I am sincerely looking forward to this, not just on a professional level, but also on a personal level. Thank you so much for joining us again, Linda.
Beth, thank you so much for having me back again. It's an honor.
So before we dive into this topic, and I have lots of thoughts on it, speaking as an adult child of divorce, why don't you tell our listeners a bit more about yourself and how you came to really spend a lot of your time clinically on the impact of divorce and kind of its ripples across the people it touches.
Okay, I will start with I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm a supervisor with the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, and have been in practice for 30 years now. I kind of choke a little bit when I say that because I'm 40, but I know we don't have video. That's a big joke, everybody.
In fourth grade, they would give you a doctoral degree, right?
How did you know that?
Exactly.
I was precocious. And insightful. Anyway, I have always done a lot of professional writing, but I was doing, it was always short form things. It was magazine articles. It was for local newspapers. And I was working on a piece on a completely unrelated topic. And you know how the internet is, you go down that rabbit hole. And in my research for the topic I was working on, I came across the term gray divorce, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. And gray divorce, for those who didn't listen previously, refers specifically to divorcing over age 50. And I got really interested in it. It got me thinking about the populations I work with and how many of my clients were 50 and older and were either divorcing or divorce questioning. And I started paying attention to it and learning all I could about the differences in working with couples getting divorced later in life than their younger counterparts. And it occurred to me, wait a minute, I'm over 50. I've been a therapist for many years, and if I wasn't looking at the differences, how many other therapists are not picking up on this? And I wrote a book called Gray Divorce, Everything You Need to Know About Later Life Marriages. When I had the draft ready to send out to my beta readers for feedback, I sent a copy to my friend Molly, who is incredibly insightful and intelligent. And when she read the book, she came back to me and she said, the book is fabulous, but what about the ACODs? And I said, the ACODs? What are you talking about? And I thought, is this word salad? Was my friend Molly having a stroke? But she said to me, you know, the ACODs, the adult children of divorce. And I said, what about them? And she said, you have to learn about them and you have to include a chapter. And so here we are. And sure enough, I very quickly, both through reading and thinking and talking to clients whose parents had divorced later in life, and in talking with in doing the research around it, I came to understand that there are a lot of problems that are not only unique to adult children of divorce, but in a lot of cases, the divorce is much harder on the older children than on the younger ones.
Thank you for diving into this topic and shedding light on it, because I think it is one that we don't talk about all that often. When we think about the impact on the children, we think about it on, the 7-year-old that now is going between houses for 1 week here and 1 week there. We don't think about it as much for the later teenager, the college student, the person who is out of the home potentially and has different realities for them. I know, speaking only for my family, a number of people in my life were in their latter teen years or in their young adulthood when their parents split up. And absolutely, the assumption was, well, you're out of the home, you're not little anymore. It doesn't have any impact on you, or it doesn't have that much impact on you. And I'm looking forward to the conversation today to kind of deconstruct some of that and see, what is the impact? So first, you've defined it, ACOD, ACOD, adult children of divorce. So when you talk about that, you're specifically referring to the byproduct of the colloquial gray divorce. So when you have somebody, if they produce children during that relationship or potentially even other relationships, when they split up later in life, then you have their adult children and what's the impact on them. And I was in my very late teens when my parents split up. I was in college. But so this is a topic that Linda knows is very near and dear to my heart and complicated.
I always want to hug you when we talk about this, Beth.
Thanks, Linda. It's complicated, and I think a lot of adults that found themselves in my position have a lot of feelings on the topic, and there aren't necessarily the same outlets, because I'm imagining a child whose parents are going through therapy, and it's are going through divorce, and then we're okay, so we're going to get that third grader into therapy, and we're going to get them into school counseling and kind of different wraparound services for the way that we think that might affect a child, but then we don't give as much attention to the adult child and how it affects them. So here we go. Linda, tell me about your average ACOD and tell me more about this demographic.
Okay. And I just want to pick up for a second on what you said about the supports we put in place for younger children. And even beyond therapy and wraparound services and all those other kinds of things, nobody sits their 18 or 20 or 30-year-old down and says, let me read this book about mommy and daddy getting divorced.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I'm there are many bibliotherapy titles that are suddenly occurring in my mind, but yes, that has not happened. At least not that I have heard of from other ACODs.
And I used the terms mommy and daddy, and obviously it's not necessarily mommy and daddy, but given the demographic of couples over age 50 and the marriage equality laws back in the day, it more typically would be a mother and father we're talking about.
Thank you for clarifying that and for taking that piece into consideration. because it does have an impact. Because if we're talking about people who are, we'll say 60 years old right now as we're recording this in 2025. So then you go back, how old were they from a statistical standpoint when they likely got married? And then what was legally permissible at that point in time. So thank you for making that point. So adult children of divorce, there are many of us. What can you tell us about us?
Okay, I would like to start with why this has not been recognized as a problem. And to do that, I will use a term that probably most therapists by now are familiar with, but at the risk of saying something you already know, it's an extremely important concept to put out there. And that is the concept of ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss was a term created by Dr. Pauline Boss, and it refers to losses that are generally not recognized by society as a loss. There are no rituals to define the loss, and oftentimes the losses are open-ended. There's no ending date to when you might stop feeling that loss. And as you said a little bit earlier, when people think about their children age 18 and older, the assumption is they're an adult, or at least they're close to an adult. They have their own lives. They have their own relationships. They may be married with their own families. This isn't going to really impact them. And the expectation is that the ACODs are going to suck up their losses and move on. And as those of us who also have trauma training understand, trauma is not what happens to you. It's not, my parents got divorced. Trauma comes from the beliefs you develop about yourself when you're going through difficult situations. And so if you have these feelings, if you have these worries, if you have this sense of responsibility, if you have questions that don't go answered and you're expected to be fine, you start questioning yourself.
In our past conversation that you and I had about gray divorce, you talked about kind of some of the factors that were contributing to the increase in adults over the age of 50 pursuing divorce. And I'm thinking about the variation between different adult children of divorce. So one thing that's really common is that, and it's a song, is Stay Together for the Kids. That idea of like, we're going to stay together while the kids are living in our house. And you and I had talked about some of those ideas in the gray divorce conversation, but I'd love to talk a little bit more about that now and kind of deconstruct it, because I think it's easy for us to think of divorce as this like kind of isolated thing that happened in a particular period in time to an adult child of divorce. So you were 26, let's say, when your parents said to you, we are pursuing a divorce, mom is moving there, mommy's moving here, and this is, we need to figure out where you're going to spend Thanksgiving. But chances are for that 26-year-old, there were all these moments leading up to it that may have been disruptive and confusing. And you know this better than I do, but divorce is typically not something that just kind of spontaneously happens. There are many contributors over time. And I can see the confusion for an adult child where it's like, we made it this far, and maybe for some, I didn't think that you parents were, blissfully happy in your union, but I didn't think this was going to happen, and kind of the sense of still getting the rug pulled out from underneath you.
Here's something really important to look at with that. it's, believe it or not, much easier for ACODs whose parents were in a high conflict marriage because they saw my parents didn't get along. They Many of them wondered many a time, why are they even staying together? So that's on one hand. On the other hand, it tends to be much harder in a lot of ways when the marriage was transactionally good, when the parents were kind to each other, when they got along well, when the family did a lot of really cool, fun things together. And maybe the parents romantically were not connected anymore, or maybe their lives were going in different directions. But in those cases, when they do come to you at 26 and say, we're getting a divorce, it can absolutely blindside the ACOD, leaving them with all kinds of trust issues. Well, if I didn't see this in my parents, what am I missing? But let's go back to the original question of staying together for the sake of the kids. Think about the message you're giving to the kids. Whether you are in a high conflict marriage and you and your spouse hate each other, or you are in a low conflict, positive transactional marriage relationship, when you tell your children, we stayed together for your sake, think about the burden that you're putting on them. Think about the guilt that you are dumping on them. What you are saying is essentially, yeah, I just sacrificed 20 or 25 or 30 years of my own life, but I did it for you. That is a lot to process.
Knowing that we can only really speak in generalization, and also wanting to clarify, for the sake of the conversation, ACODs, adult children of divorce, but I would assume marriage being a legal arrangement, that the same would still apply to people who had cohabitated and shared lives together for a long time, regardless of whether or not they'd actually gotten married.
Right. Yes, the same would apply. But again, remember the demographic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And people of the age 50 plus generation did not cohabit without marriage for the most part. And the definition of gray divorce is divorce after age 50. So yes, we can extend it to those parents who did not legally marry, and keeping in mind that the demographic we're speaking of, some of the reason they're in this situation is because they felt obligated to marry.
Very good point. When we're looking at adult children of divorce, like you mentioned, potentially feeling blindsided, it would not be very difficult for me to pull up research about the impact of high conflict divorce on young children. How much research is there about adult children of divorce and the emotional impact? Or is it, in your mind, kind of one of those areas where there's not very much?
There is not very much. Just the same as when we're talking about gray divorce, we're starting from a position of not being taught in schools as people over age 50 as a group with its own unique needs, other than the health needs people talk about. I mean, yes, you've got your people who go into gerontology as a specialty, but none of us are learning in school about the transitions over the lifespan from 50 on up. And we're not all in that basket. My life is very different now in my 60s than it was in my 50s, and I anticipate it will be very different in my 70s.
Along the same lines of that anticipation, for your average run of the mill adult child of divorce, they have now lived, at least, I mean, statistically speaking, a good amount of them have lived in that environment for their entirety of their childhood. And now this thing happens that they may not have had all that much exposure to, like as you mentioned about whether it's high conflict or low conflict and transactional. And I appreciate that language because I think that paints such a clear picture. But so here you have this adult that has still effectively fantasized about the way things are always going to be. So now they're establishing potentially their own partnerships if that's something that they're interested in. And I know one thing that I've had to contend with in my adult intimate relationships is like, well, where are we going to spend this holiday and that holiday, and is it fair? And like it gets exponentially more complicated when there are divorced parents involved. And if the other person also has divorced parents, and like the math just gets weird. But the bottom line is that you still have a child, albeit an adult child, who now is facing a much different reality with their family and with their parents than they had anticipated. And I know in our past conversation about this topic, we don't spend very much time about like the fallout of that parent's decision, which is not necessarily my way of saying don't make that decision, parents. It's just, oh, look at all the stuff that happens after this that we're not really talking about.
Right. And as parents, again, not everybody, but most families, there are rituals, there are traditions, there are things that help you feel family. And we look forward to that. You know, this is what my family does on this holiday. This is how we spend it. And the expectation is that it's just going to go on and on because this is what my family does. Now, of course, as you said, when you partner with somebody else, it becomes more complicated anyway, because then you have to factor in their family and their family's traditions, but you're only dividing by 2 when you do that. And people tend to be more creative, like, okay, we will spend Christmas Eve here and we'll spend Christmas Day here. Or we will come here for Rosh Hashanah and we will go here for Passover, or whatever your holidays or traditions, rituals are that you celebrate. Then suddenly these rituals disappear. And again, the ACODs are expected to just understand that, well, yeah, of course, our family's not together anymore, so we can't do things the way we always did. And it's a loss. And it's a loss that adult children of divorce don't get to talk about, really.
Can you speak more about some of the emotional consequences for adults whose parents are divorcing? And then I also want to talk about some of the other kind of more practical consequences, like finances and living arrangement, yeah, and caring for aging parents and how that's impacted. So let's start by the emotional, and then let's go to some of the other pieces.
Emotional consequences are huge. It totally turns the family dynamics on their head. And one of the biggest emotional consequences are loyalty issues that get set up. And again, and I'll keep saying this because I just want people to hold in mind, you're talking about parents who are over age 50 and sometimes in their 60s and 70s, and it happens even later. But the women in this demographic, again, grew up in a time where a lot of women did not have options. They got married, they had children. If they had a career, it was typically something like teaching, nursing, secretary. If anybody younger than age 40 remembers what that is or knows what that is. And typically we're not the breadwinners. We're dependent on their husband's income. And not only that, but until 1976, women could not get a mortgage without a man signing. We could not get credit cards in our own name. We could be fired from our jobs if and when we got pregnant. And so there was much greater dependency, and therefore women may not have learned a lot of the life skills needed when they do get divorced later on. They may not have learned to use a computer. They might not have learned how to fix things around the house. They may have had a husband who was paying all the bills and handling all the money, and in a lot of cases, the women didn't even know where the money was or what the money was. And so when the divorce happens, oftentimes the women need a lot more from their kids. They need them to come and help them with all these different things, teach them these things, do these things for them. Also, statistically speaking, men repartner very quickly. And so they are not typically as needy emotionally if they're repartnering quickly. And so it can set up a dynamic where the loyalty tends to shift to the mother. On the other hand, there is a biological phenomenon called serial fathering, and it speaks to the biological mission of the man to procreate as much as possible. And oftentimes what happens is when the father does get divorced and remarry or repartner, either they may have a child or children with the second wife, and because they're older and more established, they might be retired or semi-retired, and they may have more time to spend with, not only more time to spend with the new family, but it's now acceptable and expected in a lot of ways that the fathers have much more involvement than they did when I was growing up. Dad went to work, he came home, mom put dinner on the table, dad went and read the newspaper. And when I was growing up, fathers were not taking their kids to doctor appointments. They usually weren't going to PTA meetings. They were not going to every sporting event. They were not involved the way, especially with their daughters. And so there tends to be jealousy that can be established when the ACODs are saying, you're doing for these kids what I never got. And the other part of that is when there is a new wife and a new family, the new wife, and again, I use the terms in respect to the generation we're dealing with and to what the statistics say about this, but the new wife often is very threatened by the kids from the first marriage, and the dad feels like they have to choose. And so that is one of the emotional dynamics that happens. Another one of the really important emotional dynamics is the triangulation that goes on. And this goes back to, we tend to look at our adult children as adults with their own lives and not to remember that your children are always your children. And so parents tend to share way too much information. that risks triangulating the children. They tend to share information about infidelity, about financial recklessness, about things that were going on in the marriage that I don't care how old your children are, most of the time they're not on a need to know basis for those kinds of things. But there's also secondary gain for the ACODs. When your parent starts confiding in you and leaning on you and telling you all these adult parent things, it helps the ACOD. The ACODs feel important, and that can be a hard role to give up.
It has been my lived experience, the story that I know better than any, the complexity of the dividing of time and resources, the potential new relationships that are developing. So being an adult child of divorce, then meeting one parent's new partner that may become a more permanent fixture and also may not. That's been an interesting one.
Right.
So that was one that I was like, oh, I didn't expect and anticipate this. Like basically, when it happened, I wasn't like, oh, what are all of the interesting moments that are going to arise in my life that I didn't expect? And so the role reversal, I think, that happens there, that's really interesting, where all of a sudden your parent is bringing home somebody, home, so to speak, bringing somebody to dinner to introduce to you, wanting your approval and going, well, this is an interesting power shift. And then I can think of real life examples of the phenomenon that you talked about, of that idea of the new family, and how confusing and potentially detrimental that can be for the ACOD of the first family. And there are, a lot of sociologic contributors to that phenomenon. But a lot of hurt feelings, and like you'd already mentioned, not that many resources for addressing those hurt feelings, knowing that there's not all that much research about the impact of a parent's later life divorce on the adult children. You had already mentioned trust. Like, tell me kind of what some of the emotional fallout is for ACODs.
Well, I will start that by saying that when an ACOD comes into therapy, it is unusual for them to come to their first therapy session and identify their goal as, I'm feeling traumatized by my parents' divorce. Generally, they come in for other issues, and generally, it's their own relationship issues. And the trust part tends to come in when, again, like I said, it was a low conflict divorce. They didn't expect it and they didn't see it coming. And in their own relationships, maybe they're pushing somebody away because how will I know that this person isn't going to just leave me and I won't even see it coming? And it's really important for therapists to start having those conversations, obviously not foisting it on somebody, but introducing, I wonder what you didn't get when your parents divorced that you needed and how it might be impacting you now. Also, modeling, if your parents were in either a high conflict or a low conflict marriage, that was probably your model of what a marriage should look like. And you might find, the ACOD might find themselves getting into those same patterns over and over in their own marriage, or their own relationships, I should say. I keep choosing these people who things get volatile. We just argue all the time. Or they may be coming in and saying, this person is great, but I'm not feeling the spark, but on paper everything looks good, so what's wrong with me? And so a lot of the emotion tends to come from what's wrong with me.
That's what I was just thinking. So it's like you were talking about trust, and it's like trust of other, but fundamentally, I can see that distrust of self where it's, like, why didn't I catch this? Why didn't I know? Am I not worthy of being taken care of? Or, am I not able to trust my senses, particularly in those like lower conflict situations? And kind of the potential spinning that I could see result from that. Going into the potentially unpredicted fallout of a parent's divorce later in life. Like I said, I didn't really anticipate that I was going to have a parent that was effectively asking me to approve of their new partner. Like, oh, I wasn't anticipated. And the complexity around how I'm spending time and with whom I'm spending time and how it's being prioritized. And then also, if I've partnered with somebody else who also has divorced parents, the math just gets exponentially more complicated. Those are considerations, but the other things that I'm thinking about are like what happens in terms of caring for aging parents. Like that's something that's occurred to me of like, well, this parent got remarried, but this parent didn't. And so like, how does that impact how the adult child is going to manage any sense, if they have it, of filial obligation? And then also the financial impact where there was a certain amount of money that was, if it was even there, but so a certain amount of money that had been planned, and that maintaining two households is more expensive than maintaining one. Can you speak to some of those ripples that have an impact on adult children that, again, we may not be talking about and we may not be thinking about as clinicians?
Yeah, and the caretaking gets to be an even more complex issue depending on the way a parent left. I have had several clients whose parent just up and left to go find their bliss and had very little involvement with their children, with their grandchildren for maybe years. And then the parent got to a place where now they are much older, they're in failing health, or they're having financial problems, and they're coming back and asking for help. And that's a horrible, horrible conflict for the ACODs because our parents are our parents. And for the most part, no matter what they've done, we still love them or want to love them. And there's this big gaping wound of, you left me, you didn't take care of me, and now you're coming back and you want this from me. And so a lot of that work, and this also piggybacks on the other emotional and trust issues, a lot of the work with ACODs is helping them to clarify, be good with, and be able to communicate and hold their boundaries. It's not a right or wrong thing. You might have one person who says, well, I want to forgive them and I need help working on that, and that's a lot of your work. And you might have somebody else who says, I don't want to help them and I need you to help me get over the guilt with that.
If we're pulling from the demographic of adults who are splitting up later in life, again, looking at averages then around the age range of probable or potential children at the time of that divorce and separation, and the realities of the sandwich generation. So sandwich generation being the person who is generally, we'll say, between the ages of 30, 35, 50, 55, who may be raising their own children while also contending with how to support their aging parent with increasing needs, as their health and financial stability may change over time. Parents divorcing later in life has a very real impact on that. Can we talk a little bit kind of about some of the cultural considerations? So I'm thinking about multi-generational households, that's more common in certain groups of Americans than in others. Can you speak a little bit to that and the financial impact of these later in life divorces and how that may trickle down to the adult children of divorce?
Yes, I would love to. And I do also want to speak to the financial implications in more financially privileged homes as well, because that's real too. So typically in underserved populations and among people of color, there tends to be less inherited wealth, and that is wealth that can be passed down from generation to generation. So when the parents are splitting up later in life, if the parents don't have very much in the way of assets to begin with, obviously the less you have to begin with, the greater impact is going to be on the whole family system. Everybody is going to be impacted in some pretty serious ways. And for many ACODs in this group, it means maybe taking on another job to help support the family, or having a parent move in with you when that was not in anybody's plan, or if there are younger siblings, sometimes the parents either have to go back to work or go to work for the first time, and the ACOD may be called on to help take care of their younger siblings. And so it can change the trajectory of the ACOD's life in very real financial and practical ways. Now, even in more financially privileged households, there still can be a big impact. You might have grown up having had promises made to you like, we'll pay for your college, or we'll pay for your wedding, or we'll give you a down payment on your house. Parents get divorced, they're splitting the assets, and the parents may be financially okay, but they're saying, now we've split this money, and I'm sorry, we can't live up to this promise that we've been making to you for 20 or 25 years. And the ACOD is finding themselves in a position where I didn't prepare for this because I always was told I would get it. And it can also impact the child care the ACODs get for their own children. If grandparents were helping to care for the kids, suddenly either they move away, or one or both go back to work, or somebody remarries and has another family to take care of, and they're left with, we didn't budget for daycare, or we didn't apply to the good daycares, and now what do we do?
It produces considerations that the ACOD never predicted and may have been told otherwise.
But never planned for, not out of any negligence, but because they were always told, this is what we're going to do. This is how we'll take care of you.
Well, and one of the things that I've thought about as a parent, you've already alluded to it, there are complexities around what you share as a parent with your children at any point, whether that child is 5 years old, whether they're 25 years old, and how that information is going to change their worldview. And so, like, going back to the idea of kind of what we anticipate or what we tell kids, how many parents who ended up divorcing have assured their children, we're not going to divorce, right? Like, we've said quite the opposite, and we've assured them that everything is fine as if staying together is the only way that things could be fine. But, so when mom and I have that big argument and doors get slammed, it does not mean, sweetheart, we are never getting divorced. And I can only imagine how many times, too, an ACOD may have heard that. And then, the lived reality is that's not how that played out. And that difference between how we expected things to be, even if they were imperfect, and then how they actually are. And so not just the emotional impact, but all of the things that you just labeled and all of the ones that you haven't, of these things that we can't anticipate the fallout. And you're absolutely right. I've seen it across families of, okay, it's no longer feasible for this parent to live independently financially because of the way that our system has been set up and when they were working and how the money was accrued and by whom and all of that and the dividing of assets. And it's okay, well, they can afford to live independently, but this parent cannot. So then you have either one child or potentially the siblings having these tough conversations saying, so who, dad's going to move in with who? Who's it going to be? And that it completely changes the landscape for the adult child of divorce beyond just, the emotional impact of my parents divorcing. And it changes, if we celebrate holidays, it changes how we're going to celebrate holidays. But then this very practical impact of, oh my, now I need to have my teenager share a room with the other teen because my parent's going to be moving in because this is no longer feasible or reasonable for this person to be alone. And it's just this potential laundry list of complexity that the ACOD never saw coming.
Absolutely. And in terms of the way, again, the ACOD sees themselves, what they start to believe about themselves, I'm thinking in particular about somebody I worked with who was in one of those situations where the parent just pieced out for years and, came back sick and broken and I need you to take care of me. And this particular person has several siblings, and whenever the parent needs something, they always turn to this client and they call them the weak link. You'll do it because you're the weak link. And that's how they've begun to see themselves and identify themselves. And of course, that has to spill into other relationships too.
You had already talked about some of the sociocultural probabilities. And I want to go back to one of the things you said, just kind of out of my curiosity. It's my understanding, and I welcome your correction because you're more familiar about this than I am. It's my understanding that increasingly, if we're looking at hetero marriages, women are initiating divorce.
66% of great divorces are initiated by women.
More than they have in the past. And this, one of the things that I have seen, again, if we're looking specifically at hetero marriages, particularly marriages that were anticipating male as quote unquote primary breadwinner. And as you said, kind of the mismatch in skills that may develop over time because of that. One of the things that I have seen potentially is a lot of resentment from the mom of that hetero marriage. And that idea of piecing out, I've seen it. It's been interesting to see kind of different social expectations where you had mentioned with fathers, the physical ability to continue bearing children later in life, contributing to children later in life than many women are able to. And so this idea of a second family that may not happen with women the same way. And also with women, a lot of potential resentment around sacrifice I've given up so much for all of these years. I stayed married. I didn't have the financial freedom to leave, or I would have sooner. I stayed together so that you had stability through high school. And as someone who works quite a bit with young adults, I've heard more and more of a mom that kind of pieces out, where it's like, and then I left your father and I didn't want to do it anymore. And I was tired and angry and feeling resentful. And also, like, how does that impact the relationship on that adult child? And as you said, where it's like we stayed together for the kids. And how does this change that adult child's relationship to their parent? How do they relate to them? And also, I guess what I'm trying to say is individuation is hard enough.
Right.
And then when we add in like these additional layers of like, oh, wow, like what a difficult position for an ACOD to be in, to still potentially want to respect the privacy of their parents' marriage, and also wanting to understand and how painful that exploration may be to, that I know for me, like those moments where I'm like, oh my God, you're not just my parent, you're a human. That may be all the more complicated by deeply hurt feelings by the adult child of divorce for not having known more, or for having known too much, or whatever it was. When you're working with ACODs, as you said, knowing that the resources for the adult child of divorce are very different potentially than the provided community resources for a minor child of divorce, I'm imagining that you're doing a fair amount of psychoeducation and making space to unpack. Let's talk about the impact that this has had on you.
Right, which is what I was talking about earlier, that while an ACOD will come for therapy, usually for a different issue, if you're not getting to a point where you're exploring the impact of your parents' divorce, and you're not giving space and permission, then you're missing the real reason they're often coming in. I shouldn't say the real reason, the deeper reason they're coming in, the deeper ways they're being impacted and struggling in their own lives.
Yeah, as we're thinking about it, I'm also thinking about the potential taking of sides within the sibling dyad, and potential conflicts now that develop between siblings. Whose side are you taking? And like how many of the nuances that you've talked about in our time today, Linda, as I think more about them, I'm just seeing these connections over time of like, well, this thing happens and then it completely shifts that sibling relationship because now parents have split up. The one sibling who lives closer now maybe feels more pressure, more sense of obligation.
Right.
It can provide resources potentially more easily than the adult child who lives further away. So potential for resentment between those two. And like, I'm just kind of like watching this cascade
Yes. And
that goes
of course,
down and like how much we don't talk about the cascade.
Right. And as I was talking about, there's the one who becomes the identified weakest link. And so everybody puts the pressure on them. One of the things, though, that I do point out to parents when they're talking about even, older parents with ACODs, the ones who do think to ask, how might this impact my children? I like to remind them, your children are not an aggregate. Everybody has their own sensitivities, their own perceptions, their own loyalties, their own ways of being in the world. And if you have 3 children, when you tell them, chances are one is going to be devastated and angry and say, you ruined my life. One is going to say, you should have done that a long time ago. And the third one will say, okay, are you making dinner tonight?
The rule of thirds. Yeah.
So it's really important for parents to come at it from a perspective too of what do I know about my child and how they process and how they may be impacted.
So, were you to be working with an older adult who is moving toward divorce and these complexities with adult children in the picture? I'm curious, what are the things you're saying to them? Like, what are their considerations? I mean, you've mentioned some of them, but like, how do we human beings, if we are hurtling toward a great divorce, how do we work to insulate and help our adult children integrate this loss so that it's not quite as ambiguous?
Well, the first thing we need to do with the parents is to help them understand the concept of ambiguous loss and the dangers to the mental health of their adult children of sweeping it under the rug and assuming that they're just going to go on with their lives and they'll be fine. Another thing that's really important to do is to work with them to make sure they understand the reasons to have boundaries, what is and what isn't appropriate. And you've heard me say this before. One of my number one law of Linda when it comes to this is you should always love your children more than you hate your ex, and help them understand how damaging it is to their children if they are giving them too much information, giving them inappropriate information, talking badly about the other parent. And then because there is that secondary gain and there can be pushback, like, come on, mom, tell me what happened here, to help the parents be able to deliver and stick with their own boundaries when they're having these conversations.
Well, it sounds like the the critical takeaway is to have the conversations.
To have the conversations, and also to encourage the parents, if they are in a position to do so, before they make any moves, to make sure they talk to a lawyer and understand all the legal implications, to work with a financial planner, to work with a coach on how they're going to move forward with their lives and not take part of their kids' lives away in doing so, and to get the people and the systems in place as best they can to prepare for when they are older and they need more. And one other thing, and probably this is the most important thing, to let your kids know you can talk to me about this. It is safe to tell me how you're feeling, and to not judge that, to not minimize that, to not dismiss that.
I know that I'm asking you a loaded question because you've already talked about how there hasn't been a ton of research paying attention to this particular population and the realities for adult children of divorce. That said, are there any particular resources that you have found and you believe may be helpful to clinicians who are wanting to better understand what the realities may be like for these ACODs?
I'm hoping clinicians will find Grey Divorce, Everything You Need to Know About Later Life Breakups, as a good resource for them. There is also another book by Hughes and Fredenberg called Home Will Never Be the Same Again that I think could also serve as a really good resource.
Fantastic. And Linda, for our listeners who want to learn more about you and about your work, what's the best way to do that?
The best way to do that is to go to my author website, which is lindahershman.com, LindaHershman.com. And a couple of things I will mention about that. First of all, the book, if anybody's interested, is available as from Amazon as an ebook. if anybody wants the paperback copy, it is sold through my publisher, Book Baby. The other thing I would like to mention as a little giveaway, if anybody listening to this would like a free copy of a sheet you can use for parents on setting boundaries with their children, with their ACODs, and a free sheet for ACODs on how to set boundaries with their parents, if you send me an email, and my email address is on my website, I will gladly send you those sheets on setting boundaries.
Fantastic. Thank you. I appreciate offering that resource. Again, for our listeners, we have had the pleasure of hearing from Linda Hershman, licensed marriage family therapist, piggybacking on our prior conversation about gray divorce, but now diving into this conversation about ACODs. Thank you for the clarity and the compassion that you bring to this conversation, Linda, speaking as an ACOD myself. I think it helps me clinically, and it also helps me as a human being just to understand myself and my family, and then hopefully be able to offer that understanding to my clients. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me back. It was a pleasure as always.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.